The morning sun painted golden streaks across the ancient stones of St. Peter's Basilica, as musicians from every corner of Europe gathered outside its massive doors. The year was 1923, and word had spread like wildfire through concert halls and conservatories about an opportunity that came once in a lifetime. Pope Leo XIV himself had announced the Vatican's search for a new papal court pianist, a position that hadn't been filled in over 30 years. Among the crowd of hopeful candidates stood Alessandro Fontana, a young man from Naples whose calloused fingers told the story of countless hours spent at piano keys. Unlike the other musicians who wore their finest formal attire, Alessandro had chosen a simple dark suit that had seen better days. His wild black hair refused to stay combed despite his efforts that morning, and his dark eyes held a mixture of excitement and nervous energy that set him apart from the more composed candidates around him. "Did you hear?" whispered an elderly violinist to his companion. "The Pope will be judging personally. They say he has ears like a hawk and can spot a false note from across the basilica." Alessandro overheard the conversation and felt his stomach tighten. He had traveled for 3 days by train from Naples, spending the last of his savings on the ticket. His mother had pressed a small wooden cross into his palm before he left, whispering a prayer for his success. Now, standing before these magnificent doors, he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. The competition had drawn an impressive crowd. There was Vicente Rodriguez from Madrid, known throughout Spain for his perfect technique and flawless performances. From Vienna came Klaus Weber, a man whose sheet music was so precise it looked like architectural drawings. The French had sent their pride, Henri Dubois, whose performances in Paris had moved audiences to tears. Each musician carried with them years of training, prestigious awards, and the backing of powerful patrons. Alessandro carried something different. In his worn leather satchel was music that he had written himself, melodies that came to him in dreams and rhythms he heard in the streets of Naples. While other candidates practiced scales and studied ancient hymns, Alessandro had spent his time listening to the music of everyday life. The songs of fishermen, the calls of street vendors, the laughter of children playing in piazzas. As the basilica doors swung open, a hush fell over the gathered musicians. Cardinal Benedetti, a man whose stern expression had intimidated Vatican visitors for decades, appeared in his crimson robes. His voice echoed across the courtyard as he addressed the crowd. "His Holiness Pope Leo XIV has graciously agreed to oversee these auditions personally. You will perform before the Sistine Chapel choir and receive judgment from the Holy Father himself. Each candidate will have 10 minutes to demonstrate their worthiness. Sacred music only will be accepted." The musicians began filing into the basilica, their footsteps echoing off the marble floors. Alessandro found himself in the middle of the group, his heart pounding as he took in the breathtaking sight before him. The interior of St. Peter's was even more magnificent than he had imagined. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the floor. The dome soared overhead like heaven itself, and every surface seemed to gleam with divine beauty. At the front of the basilica, a grand piano had been positioned near the altar. Behind it sat the famous Sistine Chapel choir, 30 men whose voices were considered among the finest in the world. They wore their traditional, white surplices and looked like angels themselves, as they arranged their sheet music with practiced precision. But it was the figure, seated on an ornate chair to the right of the piano, that commanded everyone's attention. Pope Leo XIV sat with perfect posture, his white papal robes flowing around him like clouds. He was younger than Alessandro had expected, perhaps in his early 50s, with intelligent eyes that seemed to see into the very souls of those before him. His hands, folded in his lap, bore a ring that caught the light with every small movement. The auditions began with Vicente Rodriguez, whose performance of a traditional Latin hymn was technically perfect. Every note rang clear and true, his timing impeccable. The Pope listened with an expressionless face, occasionally nodding slightly. When Vicente finished, there was polite applause from the choir, and he bowed deeply before taking his seat with the other candidates. Klaus Weber followed with an equally impressive performance, his interpretation of a Bach piece that had been adapted for liturgical use. His fingers moved with machine-like precision, never missing a beat or hitting a wrong key. Again, the Pope watched intently, making no visible reaction. One by one, the candidates performed. Each brought their own interpretation of sacred music, but all followed the same safe pattern, classical pieces that had been approved by the Church for centuries. The Pope's expression remained unchanged, though Alessandro noticed his eyes seemed to grow more distant with each performance. Alessandro felt sweat forming on his palms as his turn approached. He had spent the journey to Rome practicing the traditional pieces he would need, but something felt wrong about playing the same music that had already been performed 5 times that morning. His fingers itched to play something different, something that came from his heart rather than a dusty book of approved hymns. "Alessandro Fontana from Naples," Cardinal Benedetti announced, consulting his list. The young man stood on unsteady legs and walked toward the piano. The instrument was more beautiful than any he had ever played, its black surface polished to mirror brightness, its keys smooth as silk under his trembling fingers. He adjusted the bench and looked out at his audience. The choir members watched him with polite attention, but Pope Leo XIV leaned forward slightly, as if sensing something different about this candidate. Alessandro placed his hands on the keys and took a deep breath. The basilica felt completely silent, so quiet that the sound of his heartbeat seemed to echo off the walls. In that moment he thought of his mother's prayers, of the long journey from Naples, of all the music that lived inside him waiting to be born. He began to play, his fingers finding the familiar notes of Ave Maria. The melody flowed through the basilica like a gentle river, each note clear and reverent. The choir members relaxed slightly, recognizing the safe choice of traditional sacred music. Pope Leo XIV settled back in his chair, his expression still unreadable, but Alessandro felt something stirring in his chest, a restlessness that grew with each measure. The music was beautiful, yes, but it felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit. His fingers began to add small embellishments, tiny flourishes that weren't written in any hymnal but felt right in his soul. The melody remained sacred, but it began to breathe with new life, like a flower opening its petals to the morning sun. The choir noticed the changes first, some of them sitting up straighter in their chairs. Pope Leo XIV's eyes sharpened, focusing intently on the young man at the piano. Alessandro was unaware of their attention, lost in the music that was flowing through him like a river finding its way to the sea. As Alessandro's fingers danced across the keys, something magical began to happen. The familiar melody of Ave Maria was still there, but it was transforming before everyone's ears like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. What started as small embellishments grew bolder with each passing measure. His left hand began to add a gentle rhythm that wasn't written in any church hymnal, a pulse that seemed to come from the very heartbeat of life itself. The change was so gradual that at first, no one was quite sure what they were hearing. Cardinal Benedetti tilted his head slightly, his brow furrowing as he tried to place the unfamiliar sounds. The choir members exchanged glances, some of them leaning forward in their chairs as if drawn by an invisible force. But it was Pope Leo XIII whose reaction was most striking. The distant look in his eyes had vanished completely, replaced by an intensity that made him appear years younger. Alessandro was no longer thinking about the audition or the watching faces around him. His eyes had closed and his body swayed gently with the music as if he were dancing while sitting. The melody was taking him somewhere else entirely, back to the streets of Naples where his grandmother used to sing while hanging laundry, where his uncle played accordion on warm summer evenings, where music lived not in books but in the laughter and tears of everyday people. The transformation came slowly, like sunrise spreading across the sky. The sacred melody remained at the heart of what he was playing, but around it grew something entirely new. His right hand began to explore harmonies that had never echoed in these ancient walls. Jazz influences crept in, not the wild, rebellious kind that some associated with sinful nightclubs, but something deeper and more soulful. It was the jazz of heartbreak and hope, of struggle and redemption, of prayers whispered in the dark. Vicente Rodriguez, still seated among the other candidates, felt his mouth drop open. In all his years of classical training, he had never heard sacred music transformed like this. It was still recognizably Ave Maria, but it was as if Alessandro had found the soul hidden beneath centuries of formal tradition and set it free to dance. Klaus Weber's precise mind was racing, trying to understand how someone could take such liberties with established music and make it sound so right. Every rule he had learned about sacred music was being broken, yet somehow the result felt more holy than any textbook performance he had ever heard. Henri Dubois found himself holding his breath. As someone who prided himself on moving audiences to tears, he recognized something in Alessandro's playing that he had never achieved in his own performances. This wasn't just technical skill or artistic interpretation. This was music that seemed to come from some place beyond human understanding. The basilica's acoustics, designed to carry the human voice in worship, embraced Alessandro's unconventional harmonies and sent them soaring. Every note seemed to find the perfect place to settle among the ancient stones, as if the building itself approved of this new sound. The stained glass windows appeared to glow brighter, the marble floors seemed to shimmer, and even the air felt charged with something electric. But it was the choir that experienced the most profound reaction. These men had spent their lives perfecting the art of sacred music. They knew every approved hymn, every traditional harmony, every rule that governed music in the church. Yet as they listened to Alessandro's transformation of Ave Maria, they felt something stirring in their hearts that they hadn't experienced in years. Father Giuseppe, the choir's eldest member, who had served the Vatican for over 4 decades, found tears forming in his eyes. The music reminded him of why he had first fallen in love with singing as a young boy, not because of rules or traditions, but because music had the power to touch something divine in the human spirit. Brother Antonio, the choir director, was struggling with conflicting emotions. His trained mind told him that what Alessandro was playing was inappropriate for this sacred space, but his heart was singing along with every note. He looked toward Pope Leo XIV, hoping for some guidance, some sign of how he should react. The Pope sat perfectly still, but his stillness was not the distant composure he had shown during the previous performances. This was the stillness of complete attention, of someone who had encountered something unexpected and profound. His hands gripped the arms of his chair, and his breathing had become deeper, more deliberate. Alessandro's playing grew more confident as the music carried him deeper into its embrace. His left hand began to add subtle syncopation, a rhythm that seemed to pulse with life itself. The melody soared and dipped, explored dark corners and bright mountaintops, told stories of joy and sorrow that spoke to the universal human experience. The young musician from Naples was no longer playing Ave Maria as it appeared in any hymnal. He was playing it as if he had discovered it in a dream, as if the Virgin Mary herself had whispered it to him. During a moment of divine inspiration, the sacred remained sacred, but it was now clothed in colors that no one in that basilica had ever imagined possible. Some of the choir members found themselves unconsciously swaying with the rhythm. Others closed their eyes and let the music wash over them like warm sunlight. A few appeared almost frightened by the intensity of their own reactions, glancing around as if to make sure they weren't the only ones feeling this strange magic. Cardinal Benedetti's stern expression had given way to something resembling wonder. As someone who had spent his life serving the Church's traditions, he should have been offended by this departure from approved sacred music. Instead, he found himself thinking of Scripture, verses about making a joyful noise unto the Lord, about how God could work through the most unexpected vessels. The music began to build toward what everyone sensed would be a powerful climax. Alessandro's whole body was now moving with the rhythm, his wild black hair falling across his forehead as he poured everything he had into the performance. His fingers flew across the keys with a passion that seemed to come from somewhere beyond mere human skill. The basilica itself seemed to hold its breath as the music reached heights that made the dome ring like a bell. Every surface reflected and amplified the sound until it felt as if the very stones were singing. The stained glass windows cast dancing rainbows across the floor that seemed to move in time with Alessandro's playing. And then, just when it seemed the music might lift everyone present right off the ground and into heaven itself, Alessandro brought it all to a close with a final, lingering chord that seemed to hang in the air forever, before slowly fading into silence. The silence that followed was unlike anything that had ever filled St. Peter's Basilica. It was not the polite quiet that follows a proper performance, but the stunned silence of people who have witnessed something they cannot quite comprehend. Alessandro slowly opened his eyes and lifted his hands from the keys, suddenly remembering where he was and what he had just done. The silence stretched on like an eternity, Alessandro sat frozen at the piano bench, his hands still hovering over the keys as if afraid to break whatever spell had just been cast. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air of the basilica, and his heart hammered against his ribs so hard he was certain everyone could hear it echoing off the marble walls. For a moment that felt like hours. Nobody moved. The choir members sat like statues, their faces showing a mixture of awe and confusion. Some looked as if they had just witnessed a miracle, while others appeared almost frightened by what they had experienced. Cardinal Benedetti's mouth hung slightly open, his usual stern composure completely shattered. But all eyes gradually turned to Pope Leo XIV, whose reaction would determine the fate of not just Alessandro, but possibly the future of music in the Vatican itself. The Holy Father sat perfectly still in his ornate chair, his face unreadable as stone. His dark eyes, which had shown such intensity during the performance, now seemed to burn with a different kind of fire altogether. Slowly, deliberately, Pope Leo XIV rose from his chair. The white silk of his papal robes rustled like whispered prayers as he stood to his full height, and the golden cross hanging from his neck caught the light streaming through the stained glass windows. Every person in the basilica held their breath, waiting for the Holy Father's judgment. Alessandro felt his stomach drop as he saw the Pope's expression. Gone was any trace of the wonder or engagement he thought he had glimpsed during his performance. Instead, the Pope's face had hardened into a mask of disapproval that seemed carved from the same marble as the statues surrounding them. "What?" Pope Leo XIV began, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space despite its quiet tone. "Was that?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Alessandro opened his mouth to respond but found that no words would come. His throat felt dry as dust and his tongue seemed to have forgotten how to form sounds. He had expected many possible reactions to his performance, but this cold disappointment was worse than his worst fears. Pope Leo XIII took a step forward, his papal slippers making soft sounds against the polished floor. "I asked you a question, young man. What did you just play in this sacred space?" "Your Holiness," Alessandro finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I played Ave Maria. I hoped Ave Maria." The Pope's eyebrows rose, and there was no mistaking the sharp edge in his voice. That was not the Ave Maria that has been sung in these halls for centuries. That was not the sacred music that has lifted souls to heaven and brought countless faithful closer to God. The words hit Alessandro like physical blows. He felt heat rushing to his face, a burning shame that started in his chest and spread through his entire body. Around him, he could sense the other musicians shifting uncomfortably in their seats, some looking relieved that they had not taken such risks with their own performances. Pope Leo XIV's voice grew stronger, more authoritative, filling the basilica with the full weight of his papal authority. "What you have done here today is a disgrace to this sacred house. You have taken music that belongs to God and twisted it with worldly influences that have no place in the church." Vicente Rodriguez exchanged a meaningful glance with Klaus Weber, both men silently thanking whatever saint had guided them to stick with traditional interpretations. Henri Dubois stared at his hands, suddenly grateful for his own safe choice of repertoire. But it was the reaction of the choir that cut Alessandro the deepest. These men who had seemed so moved by his music just moments before now looked away, unable or unwilling to meet his eyes. Father Giuseppe, who had tears on his cheeks during the performance, now studied the floor as if it held the secrets of the universe. Brother Antonio's face had returned to its professional mask, showing no trace of the emotion that had flickered there during Alessandro's playing. "You came here," the Pope continued, his voice echoing off the dome high above, "seeking to serve God through music. Instead, you have brought the corruption of jazz clubs and street corners into the very presence of the Almighty. You have shown disrespect not only to centuries of sacred tradition, but to the office of the Holy See itself." Alessandro felt tears starting to form in his eyes, but he fought them back with everything he had. He would not cry in front of these people, would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him completely broken, but inside something was crumbling like an ancient wall, finally giving way to time and weather. "Your Holiness," Alessandro tried again, his voice stronger now despite the pain in his chest. "I meant no disrespect. The music, it came from my heart. I thought perhaps—" Silence. The single word cut through the air like a blade, stopping Alessandro mid-sentence. Pope Leo XIII raised his hand, and the gesture carried the weight of absolute authority. "I have heard enough. More than enough." The Pope turned to address the entire assembly, his voice carrying to every corner of the massive space. Let this be a lesson to all who would seek to serve the Church through music. Sacred tradition exists for a reason. It has been refined over centuries by minds far greater than any of ours, blessed by saints and martyrs who gave their lives for the faith we protect. Alessandro felt the walls of the basilica closing in around him. The beautiful stained glass windows that had seemed to glow with approval during his performance now looked like judgmental eyes staring down at his failure. The marble saints carved into the walls appeared to frown with disapproval at his audacity. You will leave this place immediately, Pope Leo XIV declared, pointing toward the massive doors through which Alessandro had entered with such hope just hours before. And you will not return. The Vatican has no place for musicians who cannot tell the difference between sacred and secular, between holy and worldly. The words echoed through the basilica like thunder, and Alessandro felt each one like a physical blow. The other musicians sat in stunned silence, some looking relieved that the Pope's wrath was not directed at them, others appearing genuinely shocked by the severity of the judgment. Cardinal Benedetti stepped forward, his crimson robes a stark contrast to the Pope's white vestments. Your Holiness is merciful to offer clear guidance, he said, though his voice lacked its usual commanding tone. Brother Marco, Brother Francesco, please escort our young friend to the doors. 2 Swiss guards appeared as if from nowhere, their colorful uniforms and serious expressions making it clear that this was not a request, but a command. They moved toward Alessandro with military precision, their footsteps echoing in the terrible silence. Alessandro stood slowly, his legs feeling weak and unsteady beneath him. His hand shook as he gathered his sheet music, the papers rustling like autumn leaves in a wind that promised winter. The leather satchel that had held his dreams felt impossibly heavy as he slung it over his shoulder. As he walked toward the doors, flanked by the guards, Alessandro could feel every eye in the basilica following his progress. The sound of his footsteps seemed amplified in the silence, each step marking another moment of his public humiliation. Behind him he heard Pope Leo XIV's voice addressing the remaining candidates. Something about returning to proper sacred music and the importance of tradition. The massive doors of St. Peter's Basilica loomed ahead, and Alessandro realized that in just a few moments he would be standing outside them again. But everything would be different. His dream of serving God through music was ending, not with gentle disappointment but with public disgrace, witnessed by some of the most important musical figures in Europe. As the doors swung open and Roman sunlight streamed across his face, Alessandro stepped out of the Vatican and into an uncertain future, carrying with him the weight of failure and the echo of music that apparently had no place in the house of God. 3 days passed like a terrible dream that refused to end. Alessandro had barely left his small room in a modest boarding house near the Tiber River, surviving on bread and water when his landlady took pity on him and brought food to his door. He couldn't bring himself to eat much anyway. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard Pope Leo XIV's words echoing in his mind. You have brought the corruption of jazz clubs and street corners into the very presence of the Almighty. The worst part wasn't just the public humiliation, though that burned in his chest like a hot coal. It was the doubt that had crept into his heart like a poison. Had he really been so wrong? Was the music that felt so right to him actually an insult to God? His fingers, which had always been his closest companions, now felt foreign and clumsy when he tried to play the old upright piano in the boarding house common room. Word of his disgrace had spread quickly through Rome's musical circles. Other musicians who had witnessed his humiliation whispered about it in cafes and conservatories. Some spoke with sympathy, others with the cruel satisfaction that comes from watching someone else fail spectacularly. Alessandro had become a cautionary tale, proof of what happens when talent gets mixed with too much pride. On the morning of the 3rd day, Alessandro sat by his small window watching rain fall on the cobblestone street below. He had been thinking about returning to Naples, about facing his mother and admitting that her prayers hadn't been enough to save him from his own foolishness. His train ticket money was almost gone, but he thought he could manage the journey if he sold his good shoes. A sharp knock at his door startled him from his gloomy thoughts. Alessandro opened it expecting to see Mrs. Rossetti, his kind landlady, but instead found a young man in clerical robes standing in the narrow hallway. The priest looked nervous, glancing around as if he worried someone might be watching. You are Alessandro Fontana from Naples? the priest asked in a whisper. Yes, Alessandro replied, confused and suddenly worried that he was in even more trouble than he thought. The priest pressed a sealed envelope into his hands. You are summoned immediately to the Vatican. A carriage is waiting outside. Alessandro's legs nearly gave out beneath him. Summoned? By whom? Why? But the young priest was already hurrying down the stairs, leaving Alessandro alone with the envelope and 1,000 racing thoughts. With trembling fingers, he broke the papal seal and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, and the message was brief. Alessandro Fontana, return to the Vatican immediately. You will be met at the side entrance of St. Anna. Come alone. Tell no one. It was signed with the papal seal of Leo XIV. Alessandro's mind spun with possibilities, none of them good. Perhaps the Pope had decided that merely sending him away wasn't punishment enough. Maybe there would be formal charges, some kind of trial for desecrating sacred space. His hands shook as he grabbed his thin coat and the wooden cross his mother had given him. The carriage ride through Rome's winding streets felt like traveling to his own execution. The driver said nothing, and Alessandro was left alone with his fears and the sound of horses' hooves on wet stone. When they reached the Vatican, instead of the grand main entrance where he had arrived 3 days ago full of hope, the carriage stopped at a small unmarked door in the ancient wall. A Swiss guard let him in without a word and led him through passages he had never seen before. These weren't the magnificent public spaces of St. Peter's Basilica, but narrow corridors with simple stone walls and modest lighting. They walked for what felt like miles, turning corner after corner, going deeper into the heart of the Vatican than Alessandro had ever imagined possible. Finally, the guard stopped at a wooden door that looked no different from dozens of others they had passed. He knocked 3 times, waited for a voice from within, then opened the door and gestured for Alessandro to enter. The room was small and surprisingly simple. There were no golden decorations or magnificent artworks, just plain stone walls, a few wooden chairs, and a small altar with a simple wooden crucifix. Candles provided the only light, casting dancing shadows that made the space feel intimate and peaceful. Pope Leo XIV sat in one of the chairs, but he looked nothing like the imposing figure who had condemned Alessandro 3 days before. He wore simple white robes without any of the elaborate accessories of his papal office. His face looked tired, older somehow, and his hands rested in his lap as if they carried some invisible weight. Please, sit, the Pope said quietly, gesturing to the chair across from him. Alessandro remained standing, too nervous and confused to relax. Your Holiness, I don't understand. Why have you brought me here? Pope Leo XIV was quiet for a long moment, studying Alessandro's face in the candlelight. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than Alessandro had ever heard it, almost vulnerable. I haven't been able to stop thinking about your performance, the Pope said. For 3 days your music has been playing in my mind. During prayers, during meetings, during the quiet hours before dawn when I should be finding peace and meditation. Instead, I keep hearing those melodies you created. Alessandro felt his confusion deepening. Your Holiness, I thought. You said it was worldly corruption. The Pope's eyes closed, and he seemed to age another 10 years in the flickering candlelight. What I said in that basilica, in front of the choir and the other candidates, was what was expected of me. What the Church demanded that I say. But here, in this simple room, I can speak as Leo the man, not just as the Pope. He opened his eyes and looked directly at Alessandro. Your music stirred something in my soul that I haven't felt in decades. It reminded me of why I first fell in love with music. Before duty and tradition and the weight of this office buried that love so deep I thought it was gone forever. Alessandro sank into the chair, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. I don't understand, Your Holiness. Pope Leo XIV smiled, and it transformed his entire face. Suddenly, Alessandro could see the young man he must have once been, before the responsibilities of leading the Catholic Church had settled on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. Before I took holy orders, the Pope said, I was a musician, not a very good one perhaps, but passionate. I spent hours at the piano in my father's house in Florence, dreaming of creating something beautiful and new. I wanted to write music that would touch people's hearts, that would speak to their souls in ways that words never could. Alessandro stared at him in amazement. This was not the stern, traditional figure he had faced in St. Peter's Basilica. What happened? Alessandro asked softly. The Pope's expression grew wistful. Life happened. family expectations. The call to serve God through the church rather than through music. I convinced myself that I was choosing the higher path, that personal artistic expression was selfish compared to serving the faithful. But when I heard you play, I remembered what it felt like to have music flowing through my veins like blood. He stood and walked to the small altar, touching the simple wooden cross with gentle fingers. I have spent 30 years believing that sacred music must follow certain rules, certain traditions. But your performance made me wonder if perhaps God's voice can be heard in new harmonies as well as old ones. Alessandro felt tears forming in his eyes. Then why did you send me away? Pope Leo XIV turned back to him, and Alessandro saw pain in the older man's face. Because I was afraid of what others would think, afraid of breaking traditions that have stood for centuries, afraid that if I admitted your music moved me, I would be admitting that I have been wrong about something fundamental for my entire papacy. The two men sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of this confession settling between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Finally, Alessandro found his voice. What happens now, Your Holiness? The Pope's eyes lit up with something that looked almost like mischief. Now, my young friend from Naples, I have a proposition for you. Alessandro stared at Pope Leo XIV, his heart pounding as he waited to hear this mysterious proposition. The candlelight flickered across the Pope's face, making him look like a conspirator planning something that would shake the very foundations of the Vatican. This Sunday, the Pope said, settling back into his chair, is the feast of Saint Cecilia, the patron saint of musicians. It is our most important musical celebration of the liturgical year. Cardinals, bishops, and dignitaries from across Europe will fill St. Peter's Basilica. The finest sacred music will be performed as it has been for centuries. Alessandro nodded, wondering where this was leading and why his stomach felt like it was tied in knots. Pope Leo XIV leaned forward, his eyes bright with something that looked almost dangerous. I want you to perform that same piece again, not hidden away in some private chapel, but before the entire assembly, during the most sacred part of the Mass. Alessandro's mouth dropped open. Your Holiness, I don't understand. 3 days ago, you called my music worldly corruption. You banned me from the Vatican. Now you want me to play it again in front of everyone? The Pope smiled, and Alessandro saw something in that expression that reminded him of his own rebellious spirit. 3 days ago, I spoke as the Pope, bound by tradition and the expectations of centuries. But I have been thinking, praying, remembering who I was before this office claimed my soul. Perhaps it is time for the Church to remember that God works through all kinds of vessels, even ones that don't fit the traditional mold. But the choir, the cardinals, they'll be horrified, Alessandro protested. And after what happened last time? Oh, they will indeed be speechless, Pope Leo XIV said with a chuckle. But sometimes the Church needs to be reminded that the Holy Spirit can move in unexpected ways. Your music didn't corrupt the sacred, Alessandro. It revealed the sacred in new forms. I was too blind and too afraid to see it at first. Alessandro felt dizzy with the magnitude of what the Pope was suggesting. What if they reject it again? What if they reject you for allowing it? The Pope stood and walked to the small window, looking out at the eternal city beyond the Vatican walls. Then perhaps that will be God's will. But I cannot live with the regret of silencing something beautiful, because I was too cowardly to defend it. He turned back to Alessandro. Will you do it? Will you trust an old man who has finally remembered what it means to have faith in something beyond tradition? Alessandro thought of his mother's wooden cross in his pocket, of the prayers she had whispered over him before he left Naples. He thought of the music that lived in his heart, music that had been rejected by the very institution he had hoped to serve. And then he thought of the look in Pope Leo XIV's eyes during his performance, the spark of recognition that had passed between them. Yes, Alessandro said quietly, I'll do it. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made Rome look like a painting. St. Peter's Basilica filled with the most important figures in the Catholic Church, their colorful robes creating a tapestry of red, purple, and gold against the ancient marble. Cardinals from France, bishops from Spain, archbishops from Germany, all had come to celebrate the feast of Saint Cecilia with the Pope himself. The Sistine Chapel choir took their positions, their white surplices pristine and their faces serious with the weight of performing for such an distinguished audience. Father Giuseppe felt nervous butterflies in his stomach, as he always did before important performances. Brother Antonio had spent the entire week drilling the choir on the traditional pieces they would perform. None of them knew what Pope Leo XIV had planned. Alessandro waited in a side chapel, his hands trembling as he tried to calm his nerves. He wore the same simple dark suit he had worn to his audition, but now it felt like armor protecting him from the storm that was about to break. The wooden cross from his mother felt warm in his pocket, a tangible reminder of the faith that had brought him this far. The Mass proceeded normally for the first hour. Traditional hymns were sung with perfect precision. Latin prayers echoed through the basilica with centuries of authority behind them, and the assembled dignitaries nodded approvingly at the familiar rituals. This was the church as they knew it, as it had always been. But then, as the communion service began, Pope Leo XIV rose from his throne. Instead of following the expected liturgy, he addressed the congregation directly. "My brothers and sisters in Christ," his voice carried to every corner of the packed basilica. "Today we celebrate Saint Cecilia, who taught us that music is a pathway to the divine. But sometimes, in our devotion to tradition, we forget that the Holy Spirit continues to work in the world, continues to inspire new forms of praise." A murmur rippled through the assembly. This was not part of the usual ceremony. Cardinal Benedetti looked confused, glancing around as if seeking guidance from anyone, about what was happening. "Today," the Pope continued, "I invite you to open your hearts to the possibility that God's voice can be heard in new harmonies, as well as ancient ones." He gestured toward the side chapel where Alessandro waited. "I ask you to welcome a young musician from Naples who will share with us a different way of praising the Almighty." Alessandro walked slowly toward the piano, his footsteps echoing in a silence so complete it felt like the entire world was holding its breath. He could feel hundreds of eyes watching his every move, could sense the shock and confusion radiating from the assembled clergy. The Sistine Chapel choir stared at him with expressions of pure amazement. They recognized him as the young man who had been so publicly disgraced just days before. Father Giuseppe's eyes widened with recognition. Brother Antonio looked frantically toward Pope Leo XIV, as if surely this must be some kind of mistake. Alessandro sat at the piano bench and placed his hands on the keys. The same beautiful instrument that had been the stage for his humiliation would now be the platform for his redemption. He looked up at Pope Leo XIV, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Play from your heart, my son," the Pope said softly. "Play the music God gave you." Alessandro began with the familiar opening notes of Ave Maria, and for a moment the congregation relaxed slightly. This, at least, they recognized. But as the melody developed, as those same jazzy flourishes and unconventional harmonies began to emerge, a new kind of tension filled the basilica. Some of the cardinals shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others leaned forward, despite themselves drawn to the unexpected beauty of what they were hearing. The music swirled through the ancient space, finding every corner and crevice, transforming the familiar into something entirely new yet somehow timeless. The Sistine Chapel choir stood frozen, their mouths literally hanging open as they recognized the same performance that had caused such controversy. But this time, instead of being shocked by its inappropriateness, they were struck by its undeniable beauty. The music wasn't corrupting the sacred space. It was revealing new dimensions of sacredness they had never imagined. Father Giuseppe felt tears forming in his eyes again, but this time he didn't try to hide them. The music was speaking to something deep in his soul, something that had been sleeping under years of rigid tradition. Brother Antonio found his trained musician's ear picking out harmonies and rhythms that, while unconventional, created a perfect complement to Alessandro's playing. Almost without realizing it, he began to hum quietly along with the melody. That single tentative note from Brother Antonio was like a pebble thrown into still water. One by one, other choir members began to add their voices, not with the precision of their usual performances, but with the spontaneous joy of people discovering something wonderful. The transformation was gradual but unstoppable. What began as individual voices joining Alessandro's unconventional interpretation became a full choir harmonizing with music they had never sung before. They were improvising, something that would have been unthinkable in any other Vatican performance, but it felt as natural as breathing. The assembled congregation sat in stunned silence, witnessing something unprecedented in the history of the Catholic Church. Pope Leo XIV closed his eyes and smiled, feeling more connected to the divine than he had in decades. As the music reached its soaring climax, with Alessandro's piano and the choir's voices weaving together in perfect harmony, something magical happened. The rigid boundaries between tradition and innovation, between sacred and secular, between the old ways and new possibilities, simply melted away. When the last note faded into silence, no one moved. No one spoke. The Sistine Chapel choir stood there speechless, not with shock or disapproval, but with awe at what they had just created together. Finally, Pope Leo XIV stood and began to clap, his applause echoing through the basilica like thunder. Slowly, one by one, others joined him until the ancient walls rang with appreciation for music that honored both tradition and the endless creativity of the human spirit. Alessandro sat at the piano, tears streaming down his face, finally understanding that his music had found its home.